Hello, I'm Nathan Walters, and today I'll be going over Henry Morris's term paper for polls 3520. In this video, I'll be going over a brief summary of Henry's paper, and then in the second portion of this video, I will be giving some positive critiques back on Henry's paper. To get started, the title of this paper is Terrorist Conflict Resolution, and the main focus is on terrorism and positive peace. So now to get into the summary of the paper, the introduction starts off by giving an overview of how terrorism is used to gain political power. And Henry used a really nice quote. It's the deliberate creation or exploitation of fear through violence or the threat of violence in the pursuit of political change. I think that's a really good quote to start off, how a scholar would go about defining terrorism. And I also think it's important to note that terrorism doesn't always have to be an action of actually going and killing or going and bombing someone. That it can also be like a threat, like a verbal threat towards a government or towards a nation. I think that's important to note. But terrorism, obviously, again, is something that would cause fear to the government or the people of a certain nation. So in the opening paragraph, you already take a strong stance condemning terrorism, and I think that's important for the framing of this paper and to set us off. You condone terrorism, so like that puts you in a good stance for the rest of this paper. In the next paragraph, you set up the topic, like the main topic for the paper, and that main topic being how Northern Ireland was able to achieve and maintain positive peace. Henry, you say that that Northern Ireland, and I'm quoting your paper here, that Northern Ireland is a good example of how, when positive peace is implemented correctly, it is able to diffuse conflict even when terrorism is in the equation. So now moving on into the body paragraphs, the first thing I've noted is the good comparison of how Northern Ireland moved from bloody violence of their past and terrorism into democratic constitutional disputes. So that really shows how they moved from violence, terrorism, conflict into both sides being able to sit down in a democratic way and discuss what they were fighting over. That could also be taken care of sitting down and having treaties and stuff like that. Like everything that they were fighting over violently, they can sit down and talk about now democratically. And I think that's a good segue into positive peace of how they're able to sit down. They don't have those grudges, and they're able to move forward from their violent past. And sorry about that. And so going into the next section, Henry, you then talk about how terrorism is not always something set in stone, but it should be handled case by case. And I think what you mean by that is that you don't always know how to fight or control a terrorist group. It's going to be different every time. Their motive's going to be different. Their use of the terrorist acts are going to be different each time. So it should be handled case by case. I like how you mentioned that. But the overall way that you should try to handle each terrorist act should be towards positive peace. You're moving towards mending your relationship. It's not always about fighting back or striking back. It should be about trying to bring both sides closer. Why are we fighting? What are our differences, and how we're going to move forward from that? And so you say that fighting against terrorism the wrong way can lead to worse unknown future. But if the country is able to push towards your positive peace, something that is going to last, their future should be bright and filled with democracy. And you've already stated that by saying how Ireland can now sit down democratically and talk out their differences. So the next main section of this paper brings up the difference between positive peace and negative peace. This is actually a topic that I cover in my paper, so I think that together we should be able to really narrow down a great definition, and for both of our sections, we can move forward helping each other out here. So you note that positive peace and negative peace are different, but they are still better than the alternative, which is to continue with violence. And so now positive peace is not just peace. it is justice for all. As I think I mentioned earlier, positive peace is both groups now moving forward, mending their relationship of their violent pasts between the two fighting groups. They're trying to move now towards a democratic future where they can both now sit down and not have this violence. It allows for both groups to start new and not really want to go back to their violent past. They have that behind them, and they've now both in their minds moved forward past that. And so on the other side of positive peace, you have negative peace. And negative peace is just the absence of conflict. As you stated, it can simply be through signing a treaty or a ceasefire or something that just says that both sides are not going to fight anymore. And I think that's important to note because when both sides, they're just done fighting, that doesn't really solve the core problem, and that they're still going to have that in the back of their minds. And I think that through negative peace, it just prolongs more violence. And the difference between, or that through negative peace, there's still going to be violence, I think, later, because again, nothing was really solved. And you say that, and I'm quoting again, when this happens, both sides will be treated right, and violence will be much easier to avoid in the future. And that's in terms of positive peace. When both groups come to that agreement on both sides, they're able to move past all those differences and move into a future together and mend those relationships. Your section on positive and negative peace, it was really well researched, and it was much needed to move forward into the more body paragraphs. Your next section starts off with what is present in areas where there is conflict. You bring up that there's going to be multiple ethnic groups, religious groups, unstable government, or possibly disagreement like over the economy or something. And so when those factors are present in a nation, they're most likely going to have some kind of violence or conflict. And so as you mentioned now, for Northern Ireland, these factors that led into the violence was the dispute between whether or not Britain should retain control of Ulster and other parts of Ireland, or if Ireland should be united as one. And so the two groups that are fighting in this are, one is called the Unionists and the other one is the Nationalists. These groups are from different religious and ethnic backgrounds, but you mentioned that doesn't really play too much into why they were fighting. It was more that they were fighting over the future of their country, whether Britain should retain control over part of it, or if they should kick out Britain and unite Northern Ireland with the rest of Ireland. And so you also say that the Unionists were Protestants who were British colonizers, and that the Nationalists were more a Catholic minority who wanted to unite Northern Ireland with the rest of Ireland. And so moving on into what both sides wanted, the Nationalist group was concerned that they were going to be oppressed and not given the rights that they deserved if Ireland was going to be still separate as owned by the British. And so the Nationalists thought that if they were separate, they were not going to receive the rights and that they were going to be oppressed. And as you mentioned, that they were right to believe that the persecution may occur, as in the past they had been discriminated against. So there, as you mentioned, that brings in history. So they learned once that that if it stays separate, that they were not going to be receiving the rights that they want. And so now they're trying to move forward. So now, as you mentioned, in the next section, that the conflict began in the 1960s when a peaceful civil rights movement was met with suppression from the British. And this was, so this is an example of using nonviolence, a simple civil rights movement, and it being met with aggression. And so that's gonna make the Nationalists take a step back and think, you know, if we're going to be using nonviolence, we're going to be met with violence. Why don't we turn to violence? So yeah, the Nationalists felt threatened by the Protestants, and so they again created the IRA. And so now the IRA is it's the terrorist group in this story, and they start to militarize, and they want to unify Ireland by any costs. So now they turn violent, and they use terrorist acts to attempt to change the political situation that was taking place and influence it so that it would benefit them. And you have a quote here from Benjamin Wills, and he says that the IRA wanted to expel British rule from the 6 countries of Ulster to cow 1 million Protestants who are determined to keep Ulster as British, or Devon to Lancashire, to unify all Ireland by persuasion or force. So they are now the terrorist group in this situation, and they are meeting violence with violence, which is not going to work. When you meet violence with violence, it's only going to lead to more violence, as we saw from some of the readings. You have to move forward with nonviolence or towards positive peace, which your paper then gets into in the next section. So as you mentioned, the IRA is now carrying out attacks in Ireland against the Protestants, and then also across the sea in Great Britain. They're now doing terrorist acts over there. So they're trying to strike fear in both sides of the British, being in Ireland and in Great Britain. And so they are the terrorist group in this. And so then you go on and talk about how international actors will intervene when conflict is occurring around the world. You say, by example, the United Nations will hopefully step in if there's a conflict between 2 nations that lie under their jurisdiction. And so what this is saying is when the United Nations has to step in and enact their force, this is an example of negative peace. They are calling for a ceasefire or a treaty, and that's just a piece of paper saying, like, hey, don't do this anymore. It's not actually getting to the root of the problem. It's not solving the problem, and so there's going to be violence in the future. If something is solved with negative peace, it's just setting up for violence. So when you use positive peace, again, it moves forward. Both sides can then move forward in that relationship.